All right. So again, thanks everybody for being here. We have about just shy of 100 attendees already with us. So we want to welcome everybody. Thanks everybody for being here today. As I've said a couple times now, my name is Justin Howell. I am the Executive Director here for the IRC in Atlanta. I want to welcome everybody here today as we learn about what most of us have seen on the news and have read about in terms of the events happening on the ground in Afghanistan and those impacts on the Afghan people and the evacuation efforts that have been undertaken by the U.S. government, but wanted to bring together a local panel today to discuss more about how we as a community here in Atlanta are preparing to welcome new Afghan arrivals. So as many of you know, the IRC has been playing a role in the 8 government processing facilities around this country that have been initially welcoming Afghan evacuees as they arrive into this country for processing and then for beginning their onward travel to their new home communities. And I myself have just returned from a 2-week deployment at one of these military facilities, and just want to bring back some experiences that we have had, but also share here with the community, but also get reactions from our friends, our panelists that are here today. So as many of you know, the IRC in Atlanta is preparing to welcome 800 of the 1,080 Afghan allies that were expected to arrive here in Georgia over the next 6 months. And we know that for IRC to successfully welcome and support 75% of the Afghan new arrivals that will be coming into the state, we acknowledge that it will require a whole community response, right? And so this means that while we rely on our community champions, our donors, our volunteers, many of whom have joined us today on this webinar, it's also going to require us to work in close partnership with other organizations here in the Atlanta area to ensure coordination of our efforts and to ensure mutual support for all of us as service providers as we provide services and support to our allies as they arrive here into the Atlanta community. So it's my pleasure today to introduce our panelists for this webinar. First, I'd like to introduce Marjan Nadir, who is the Economic Empowerment Manager at Refugee Women's Network. I'd also like to introduce Alpa Amin, who is the Executive Director of Georgia Asylum and Immigration Network, also known by the acronym GAIN, and Chris Purdy, who is the Director of Veterans for American Ideals. And so what I'd like for us to start off with is just giving everybody an opportunity to go around and share a little bit about your particular organization, the organization's mission, and just a brief synopsis of what your organization's work and focus is. So maybe we'll start with you, Marjan.
Hi, thank you, Justin. Good afternoon, everyone. So I work with Refugee Women's Network, and Refugee Women's Network is a nonprofit organization that is in the state of Georgia. We've been here for more than 20 years, and our emphasis and our focus is on refugee and immigrant women. So we serve refugee and immigrant women that are resettled in the state of Georgia we meet them where they are. So from initial resettlement through social adjustment services that is focused on, community cohesion, and from enrollment of schools to things of that nature to economic empowerment in terms of job placement. We also have a leadership training program that gives them the skills and confidence to take on leadership roles in their work in communities advocating for themselves. Aside from that, in response to COVID-19, we had our Community Health Promoters Program, which identifies and trains female community health promoters from multicultural backgrounds. It's a train-the-trainer model, and it's been very timely in, allowing healthcare to be accessible to everyone. The need for the response has also spawned our newest programs, which center around wellness, yoga, and our hiking group, which is very popular and everyone enjoys it. Aside from that, we also have a Civic Engagement program, which again is all about engaging in problem solving and decision making for issues that matter to the refugee and immigrant communities. And we honestly do all of this work in partnership with the wonderful organizations that are in Clarkston. And the program that I work in is the Women's Economic Empowerment Program, which equips refugee and immigrant women with the knowledge and resources to become economically self-sufficient. And that's done through employment, entrepreneurship development, and financial literacy.
Great, thanks, Marjan. Yeah, again, this focus on holistic programming, I think that's a function of many service providers in the in this space is really focusing on the whole person, not just one particular isolated aspect, which I think makes such a powerful community of service providers we share this space with. I think also, you're mentioning of COVID-19, some of that's impacted us all. And again, seeing service providers step up in that space when there was need for those services. Again, I know it's something a lot of us in this community take a lot of pride on, of trying to help step up and meet those gaps. I'm really appreciative to have Refugee Women's Network in this space and partner in a lot of this work. Alpa, can you tell us a little bit about GAIN?
Yes, thanks, Justin. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alpa Amin, Executive Director of the Georgia Asylum and Immigration Network. We are an immigration nonprofit with a mission to protect and empower immigrant survivors of crime and persecution. So similar to what you just heard from Marjan and Justin, we take a very holistic approach to serving the needs of our clients. We are providing immigration legal services, but with an eye towards the needs of our clients, their basic needs, other social service needs. So we work very closely in our community. We were founded in 2005 primarily to assist asylum seekers here in the state of Georgia. We know that access to legal representation significantly improves someone's chances of success in their case. And so we were designed to provide training and technical support to volunteer attorneys who wanted to assist asylum seekers navigate the process. Since that time, we've expanded our programming, and now we serve other survivors of crime, including domestic abuse, sexual assault, and both labor and sex trafficking. Our establishment is fairly small. We have a very small team, but with a great impact. And we accomplish that with the support of our community partners and with the volunteer support of our legal community. And this is essentially the same model that we have repurposed to respond to the crisis in Afghanistan through the creation of Project Ally. And I look forward to telling you all more about that a bit later.
Great. Thank you, Alpa. Yes, this notion of making sure not only do we serve people while they're here, but make sure that they have legal protections and a pathway to remain in communities that they're contributing to so greatly, right? That's really important work. And we're appreciative to have GAIN in this community doing this essential work with us. Chris, tell us a little bit about Veterans for American Ideals.
Yeah, thanks, Justin, and thank you, IRC, for putting this on. I would be remiss to note, if I didn't note, that the IRC offered me the first speaking engagement on this topic many years, well, about 5 years ago at this point. So I'm very grateful to be here again. So as just mentioned, I'm the director of Vets for American Ideals at Human Rights First. Human Rights First is a national advocacy organization that pushes for refugee and immigration efforts on the national level. And we also do a variety of other human rights advocacy, but we've been very focused on the Afghan issue for a long time. And as director of the Vets for American Ideals program, we have a national cohort of veterans around the country who care about human rights issues and who care a lot about the Afghan crisis, and specifically within that, the special immigrant visa holders, those folks who serve alongside American forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, who have access to a special pathway to residency and citizenship here in the U.S. We have about 10,000 members nationwide in our VFAI team, but Human Rights First has been around for a long time, and we currently lead the Evacuate Our Allies Coalition. Along with other resettlement and human rights organizations. We have been pushing since April for an evacuation with obviously mixed success up until August. And then since the August evacuation, we've been at the forefront in providing policy solutions to the incoming refugees who are coming in a variety of different statuses, and to make sure that they all have the resources that they need, and the local resettlement agencies like the IRC here in Atlanta and others can resettle this community as they become our neighbors. So.
Great, thank you, Chris. Yeah, and you mentioned, I know some of them we've already seen a little bit in the chat here on these different groups that we talk about, right? In terms of immigration status, SIVs, or refugees, or now parolees, and luckily Alpa's here as our immigration expert a little bit later. Hopefully she'll help us understand from a legal perspective. I did want to talk a little bit about numbers, just to address it right up front, because I know there's quite a bit of chatter in the chat about it. So what we know right now is that of this particular class of Afghan arrivals that have been classified as humanitarian parolees. And again, we'll get into that a little bit later. These are folks that were evacuated from Afghanistan over this last several weeks that we've all seen on the news. They are basically arriving into this country as humanitarian parolees. And what we know right now is that the state of Georgia has agreed to accept 1,080 Afghan humanitarian parolees. Of that 1,080, about 1,030 will be here in the metro Atlanta area. And of those, 800 of those individuals will be resettled and supported in their transition to their new communities by the IRC here in Atlanta. So again, that's why this is such an important topic for us, and why it's on the front of our mind as we engage in coalition with our partners in order to prepare to serve our new arriving community members. Actually, this is really timely because we just welcomed our first 2 new families just this week. On Monday and Tuesday of this week, we welcomed 2 Afghan families through this program. And so we know this will be the beginning, and we look forward to welcoming more. So I just want to clarify that in terms of numbers we're talking, but hopefully more will come out through the rest of the conversation. So I want to turn now to you again, Marjan. As a member of the Afghan community here in Atlanta, I'm always struck when, especially now that this has been in the news more, people are always saying things like, what are you doing to prepare to receive Afghan community members? I'm like, well, we've actually been serving Afghan community members for well over 20 years. As Chris has said, there's been the SIV program, before that, even the Refugee Resettlement Program. There's a very robust Afghan community here in Atlanta. So I'd like for you to tell us a little bit just about that community, if you can, but also in particular, how have the events that everybody has been watching on the news and on TV over these last several weeks and months, how's that impacted the local community here?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Justin. So in terms, as you said, this is the work that we've been doing. This is the work we will continue to do. I think it being in the spotlight, there is, an appreciation for the amount of camaraderie that has come from this, from resettlement agencies to other nonprofit organizations to corporate America. Everyone is really understanding the importance of coming together during this time. In terms of the current Afghan community, as you mentioned, it's actually really funny. My family was resettled by the IRC like 20 years ago. So we've been here for, in terms of resettlement and working with the Afghan communities, this is a work that's been ongoing. And the current Afghan community here, and I know I can just speak in terms of like RWN, we serve over like 140 families currently, and that is done all collaboratively, whether it's through IRC's IDA program, whether it is ESL classes through Piedmont Technical College, whether it's, working with CPACs for rental assistance and also ESL classes. So that effort has always been there and will continue to be there. And I can't speak for the entire Afghan community, but I can speak for myself. This has been probably the most challenging time to occupy. It's a really interesting space because I always felt, I felt very disjointed in a sense. I would hear the news and the rhetoric here, and then I would speak to my cousins and I would speak to my uncle back home. And, my grandma is still there, by the way, stuck. So it's just, the concept of just first, I think the one thing I would like to say is please always filter your where you're getting your news and understand the perspectives that are at play. And in terms of the community, I've just seen some comments that can, lightly be considered insensitive, if not just very, very, very hurtful. Not giving precedence to the Afghan people, not understanding the humanity that is in question here, the innocent lives that at the end of the day are the ones that suffer. And as an Afghan woman, the hardest thing is this uncertainty that will face, someone as close as my cousins. And these kind of situations, we think we're far removed from them. But bear in mind, everything happened a month and a half ago. So within days, within, weeks, situations just occur that are completely out of our control. So as you know, as we all have rallied, and especially to the Afghan community that is in Atlanta, they've really, from the protests to the dinners to, advocating and volunteering. And I know they're collecting efforts right now for donations for the new families that are coming in. The support is there. The community is present. The community just needs everyone to rally behind them, because this is going to take as much collective effort as possible. And I know that, when we first came in, I was in elementary school. So I don't want to take away from a refugee woman's actual challenges, because it was a little bit easier for me. As you transition into school at an earlier age, like the language and stuff, as soon as you're able to overcome those barriers, it becomes a little bit easier. But I know for, the families, it's a continual transition of trying to understand their new home, trying to understand the culture here, assimilating and thriving while, keeping connected with their roots and their culture. So I am grateful that the community here will support the new community. From something as simple as they will have a culturally appropriate meal, so that, because the first thing, it's the small things, right? You're not able to really go into a local grocery store and grab the foods that you normally eat. Something as simple as maybe finding the halal meat store. So the Afghan community here is really pivotal and impactful in helping guide, and they did the same thing for us. I remember when we came, there were multiple families that reached out that helped 20 years ago, and that process of always reaching back and helping each other will remain. So the work has been there, the work will continue to be there. It has been an extremely difficult time, and the Afghan community just, once it's off of the news, right now we've already seen a diminish in terms of it just being in the news cycle. That's when it really matters. The real work, there's a lot of work on multiple levels, work there that needs to be done. The work here that needs to be done is honestly just getting started in terms of the new arrivals and what we will need to do to welcome them. And Alpa will speak more, but even like their status, what will they even qualify to be able to work? And so I think the layers to it and the intricacies to this, it just requires a collective effort. But we've been here, and the Afghan community has been here. IRC serve them, all the other nonprofit organizations serves them, and we will continue to do so.
Great, thank you, Marjan. First, I want to just thank you for your courage to share your story. And I think you bring up a great point, which is something we have been focusing on here at the IRC. When people ask what can people do, the first thing we say is listen to the Afghan community directly, right? We need to be taking our lead from the Afghan community directly, and that part of that for many of our supporters may be understanding that there is an Afghan community here, and spending more time in Clarkston and other places around, and getting to know the community members around, sharing a cup of coffee, sharing a story, sharing community with people, right? That is probably a great first step. And I think, you also bring up a lot of great points about, the need to be aware that we cannot paint community members with a broad brush. We can't talk about the needs of all Afghan community members, right? That we have to look at each family as a unique entity that we need to be able to serve in a unique way. And we need the flexibility and the capacity to do so. And again, I think that's why we're here today having this conversation. So thanks for bringing those things up, Marjan. Alpa, I know that one thing that our friends Marjan and others at Refugee Women's Network did early on in the response was to create a partnership with you all at GAIN to create a new project called Project Ally to really meet some of the demands that I think many of us in this space were hearing coming out of the Afghan community. So could you tell us a little bit about Project Ally and like what kind of services that you provide through that project, and kind of what you're hearing from the community in terms of people accessing that project or those programs?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to just start off by underscoring a couple things that Marjan said and that you echoed, Justin. It is so important to honor the needs and the lived experiences of the families who are going through this process. It's not just that they are separated from their loved ones, it's that they're having to navigate a very complex immigration process. It's that they are having to overcome certain hurdles to obtaining the legal remedies, which I'll get into a little bit later. but also a lot of the people that I'm interacting with, that I have the privilege of interacting with, are also who are on the front lines of these efforts, are also personally impacted. As Marjan said, people have family members, loved ones still abroad, and so they're trying to help others while trying to help themselves at the same time. And it is extremely honorable what they're doing, and we at GAIN certainly appreciate and respect and are grateful for the opportunity to work with you. Another thing, I wanted to say is that when all of this began, this idea of this crisis being in Afghanistan, what's become increasingly clear is that the crisis is not limited to Afghanistan. It's happening here. It's affecting families. It's affecting people who don't know whether or when they'll see their loved ones again. And so I want to make that very clear. And what we saw at GAIN was early on in August, we started receiving phone calls from family members here in Georgia, people who wanted assistance with evacuation. We knew we needed to do something. We didn't know what our capacity was. As I mentioned earlier, we have a fairly small staff, but we do operate through a volunteer model that allows us to lean on members of our community to provide support. And so what we decided to do was to launch a hotline. And that was done in conjunction with, informed by Refugee Women's Network and the advocates there, and with the support of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. Those are our private immigration attorneys here in Georgia. So in consultation with both of those groups, we launched Project Ally to field phone calls from what we thought would be families here in Georgia needing evacuation support. We knew we weren't actually going to be able to ensure people were able to board planes, but we could refer them to resources that were available, answer some basic questions, and that was our original intent. In the first week of operation, we received over 150 calls for help. That number has gone up significantly. I think at this point, we have assessed the immigration options for over 300 Afghan nationals, and we are doing this all with volunteer support. And so we are extremely grateful. Again, I think that speaks volumes to the partnership, the strength of those relationships. And I'm grateful that we were able to so quickly motivate and mobilize to provide a response. Now, what we're seeing is that because of the volume of calls that we're receiving, we had to shift our focus to doing what we are able to do and the tangible outcome that we can produce. And so what that means is that we are currently assisting families with humanitarian parole. And I think we'll get into this a little bit later, but there are distinctions as to how people are able to travel to the United States. But humanitarian parole is allowing family members to apply for, Afghans in Georgia and around the US apply for their family members abroad. Parole allows for people to obtain a travel document, to board a plane and come to the United States. And at this point in time, we have about 25 of those applications either filed or in the process of being filed. And so we are hoping to scale up and provide additional support in the weeks ahead. But as I mentioned, capacity is of course an issue, and we just want to do right by those families that we have agreed to provide representation to, and make sure that they are hopefully have the best chance of reuniting with their families.
And thank you all for that. Those services are so critical, and giving community members here just a trusted expert in this field to navigate a very complex immigration system. I would probably venture to say most people on this call cannot independently navigate the immigration network system as it is now, and to have a dedicated group of professionals such as yourself and others is invaluable at a time like this. And so we appreciate the work you're doing with Project Ally. We see some questions about Project Ally in the chat, and I know we'll get to, and we're posting information on the way people can learn more or share your number in the hotline that y'all established with Refugee Women's Network to share with community members. Chris, I want to turn to you, and one of the things that I was really struck by, my recent deployment to support the efforts of Operation Allies Welcome, which is the federal response to the Afghan evacuation. It was the first time I've ever really worked directly in emergency response. It was also the first time I've ever worked on a military base. It was also the first time I've ever worked closely with federal agencies, including the military. And, you know, one thing I will have to say that I have been struck by was the level of commitment from all levels within the government. And they're really the ones that talk about this as a whole of government response, which kind of really helped me think more about a whole of community response, that we need to match the same level of commitment across our seeming divides or seeming, you know, little talking points and all this other stuff. And, you know, we've even been contacted of late by active duty as well as retired military and guard, just talking about how they can support Afghan arrivals or even particular families that they had contact with back in Afghanistan. So I'd be interested, you know, because since you are, you know, working with vets all the time yourself, a vet, like, what are you hearing from the military contacts you have? And, you know, is this situation different? And if so, why?
Yeah, thanks. Well, it's very different than previous, migration issues for no other reason than this country's been involved in Afghanistan in a military capacity for 20 years. And so there is a deep personal connection between the military community and the people of Afghanistan. And that's something that I think people were unaware of, or at least were surprised at the level of the emotional reaction to the withdrawal, and then the evacuation of Kabul. So the veteran community feels a moral obligation, a deep moral obligation to make sure that this is done right. On the surface, it doesn't seem like, you know, veterans and immigrants are natural allies, but you know, as the aforementioned connection, I mean, it is who we are as a people, as a veteran community, to not leave anyone behind. And what we saw over the course of this evacuation and over the course of withdrawal is us effectively doing that. So there was significant moral injury done to the veteran community, and this is now an attempt to repair that moral injury. And so we have, at Vets for American Ideals and Human Rights First, we have been organizing veterans to speak out on this. We've got letters going back to April, calling for support for our Afghan partners. And since the evacuation, we've rallied veterans around the country to speak out in behalf of resettlement benefits and ensuring people who are coming here under the various statuses that I think we're probably going to get into are all eligible to receive benefits that would allow them to be welcomed in as our neighbors appropriately. I really can't emphasize this enough, that it's something that the veteran community never thought that we would have to do. But it's something that we're committed to doing, and we're not going away. This is not something that I think will be passing in the next few months. Veterans are committed to this, and that is reflecting on the pressure to the U.S. government, which is why you have seen such an effort on the State Department, on DOD, on DHS. They know, in part, a large part, frankly, to the work done by the VA Secretary McDonough, who has met weekly with veterans groups. They have done the whole executive branch has gone over and above beyond what we would have anticipated on what it means for engagement, both in veterans groups, but also the broader community. So DHS, for example, is standing up weekly working groups, or liaison groups as they're calling them. State Department is meeting bi-weekly with concerned stakeholders, and DOD for a long time has maintained a significant engagement with the community. So this is something that we're hoping to kind of parlay into a broader engagement on immigration reform and refugee advocacy. But the Afghan crisis is something that strikes deeply into the hearts of the veteran community.
Thanks for sharing that perspective, Chris. I think it's one that many of us in this line of work don't necessarily get to hear very often because we don't have many opportunities to talk across what we see as maybe divides, oftentimes artificial, I believe. And I also appreciate you bringing up the notion of this being a moral calling. I think many of us in this space see this as our humanitarian and moral duty. And we at the IRC have very proudly stood up to say we will accept 75% of all the Afghan parolees coming into the state. Will there be challenges? Sure. But we know that together with our champions, with our donors, our supporters, with dedicated community support and organizations like you all, that we collectively are going to get this job done. And so I really appreciate that perspective. Marjan, I mean, so, asking Chris, is this different, is this particular time and the situation of the families who we will be welcoming through the parole process different? I think we all know it is, because they have a different legal designation, which again we'll get into in just a minute. But from your space as someone in the community, but also a service provider to the community, just given how recent many of the events have been that will cause people to have to evacuate, and then just going through this evacuation process itself, this is something I don't think we've seen in the 25 years we've been working with the Afghan community. So, what are you as a service provider, you and Refugee Women's Network, how are you thinking about service delivery a little bit different, maybe in the short term and long term for some of these specific needs? And then, also just to broaden a little bit, like, what would you suggest for community members of goodwill that will be needed to support recently evacuated families? How can they help? To you.
So I think the one thing is, I think the needs will stay the same. In terms of the Afghan communities that we serve here, the major barriers are always transportation. It's childcare. It's also the lack of parallel work opportunities. We have doctors that work in customer service, because we can get into that later. Darlene is here. But that right there, those issues will remain the same because these systems haven't changed, right? So from even the time that when my family came, and that point was this direct point to the challenges that my mother faced. Like, she came in as a pediatrician and worked in customer service because there's no way for I mean, there is, but it's a very extended process, and degrees and certifications are not really recognized. So that right there, those challenges have remained the same. When you talk about driver's license, you have Afghan men and women that may have driven for years in Afghanistan, but unfortunately the written exam here, the permit exam, is not available in Farsi. So that means either traveling to like Florida, or it means trying to wait as long as you possibly can to grasp the language, to then take your permit exam, to then be able to go get the practical exam for driving. So there is a lot of room for advocacy. I mean, I think something that simple, transportation, is a very big barrier. So that childcare, those things will remain intact. One thing we know is that we're very community driven and community focused, and really everything we do is to be inclusive of the voices that we are serving. So that aspect, we want to continue that model. But one thing that we know we will need to do is scale in terms of partnerships, collaboration, and also capacity, right? So we've brought on a new caseworker for the Afghan community that is going to speak Farsi and Pashto, because language accessibility is very important. Even in terms of evacuation efforts, we had a client of ours that was stuck with her son. They were calling her, but they were calling her in English. And so that's how important language was. So she was barely able to get out like the second day or something. And it was as a result because one of our case managers here was monitoring the phone calls and had to field a phone call. And so, those pieces shouldn't be that missing. If you are calling someone to, and this is a green card holder, this is a permanent resident, if you're calling them, you should call them with language accessibility. And so the same thing goes in terms of services here. The accessibility is very important. Making sure it's community driven is very important. We're just increasing capacity and partnerships. So, wonderful partners like GAIN, working more closely with IRC and other nonprofit organizations. So that's really how we hope to move forward in making sure that, because I think the work we do will remain the same. We're just going to have to do it in a very multiplied manner. So the thing that we really want to say is, to those that want to serve in the space, please serve in a manner where you are looking to those that have occupied the space. So, looking to those that have had the experience in guiding the process, because sometimes, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Someone has already probably been doing that, or they've already started that effort. So I think we get further together, and there's a lot of capacity to do a lot of great work, and just really looking to those that are able to really understand the space and guide the direction of the effort, I think will be really helpful, because sometimes we have these brilliant ideas, but the community doesn't need them. The community doesn't ask for them. So you're just, it's a lot of effort that at the end of the day may not be representative of the actual needs of the community. So that's one thing that we really, really want to echo.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing for people to hear, right? So oftentimes people want to do their little project they want to do, and it isn't necessarily what the needs of the community are. And so at times, reaching out to Refugee Women's Network or GAIN or IRC or one of the other agencies that have spent decades in this space to help in a synergistic effort rather than sort of a lone wolf actor sometimes is a lot of times more impactful in the long run. So I think that you bring up a great point, Marjan. I'm glad you shared that with our community. All right, Alpa, I know now comes the $1 million question everybody is wanting to hear more about is, can you tell us what is going on with all these different immigration statuses, right? I mean, people who've followed the IRC's work and even Refugee Women's Network's work, we know as primarily as serving the refugee community here of Georgia. But now, and Chris mentioned earlier SIVs, and now this whole new, many people may have never heard of humanitarian parolees that were welcoming our Afghan allies with that particular designation. And so, can you help us try to understand a little bit in broad strokes, like what those different groups are and what particular challenges are facing humanitarian parolees as they begin entering here into the Atlanta community?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I recognize that the purpose of today's call is to talk about how our community is responding and has mobilized and will continue to respond in the days ahead. But I think it's healthy to discuss what some of the barriers are legally and procedurally. So, and before I get into the various categories, I just want to say that and level set, because one of the things I'm noticing is a barrier across the board is just lack of information and misinformation, which is why we're here talking today. And I think all of us, or a lot of us, have come by this honestly. There was so much that happened so quickly, and so much information was being put out through different streams that it was hard to digest it all, to know what is true and authentic. And so we're learning as we go. As practitioners who have been in this immigration space for years, we are having to learn and relearn and also understand what new protections are in place for Afghan nationals. So one of the things that I also want to add is that historically there's been this distinction between refugees and asylees. And the reason why we're here together on this call is because what we know is that legally there is no distinction. A refugee is an asylee. The only difference is the procedure and how they go about obtaining that status and entering the United States. And so the four main categories, if you will, for how people are able to travel from Afghanistan to the United States are: one, SIV, Special Immigrant Visa, which is what Chris alluded to earlier. And this is a relief that is being afforded to people who are affiliated with the US military in Afghanistan or Afghan forces. They are given this status abroad. So they enter the United States as an SIV. They're essentially allowed to be legal permanent residents. So they have all the rights and remedies available for the LPRs, i.e. they have a green card. There is another category of parolees. These are SI and SQ parolees. So these are people who may have already started the SIV process. They may be somewhere in limbo, but they hadn't obtained the SIV status prior to being evacuated from Afghanistan. They are arriving here in the United States and then eligible to apply for lawful permanent residence. You then have the humanitarian parole applicants that we've been talking a little bit about. Now, these are people, a lot of them actually have pending applications. They may have applied for SIV, but it's been months and they haven't heard any kind of response. They may have qualified for evacuation support, but they lived outside of Kabul and weren't able to board one of those flights, or they didn't know what the procedure or the rights were to begin with. And so now now, now that word of Project Ally and other similar efforts has gotten out, they are reaching out asking for support. A lot of these humanitarian parole applicants have contacts in the United States. They have family members who can be US sponsors for them, but some of them do not. And so one of the challenges at Project Ally that we have is figuring out who is it that we can actually help, because legally you are required to have a sponsor here in the United States. And so without that, we are not able to move forward with this remedy that exists. And then the fourth and final bucket I will just mention is the P2 refugee status. This, coupled with humanitarian parole, both of these categories require someone essentially to travel to another country to obtain permission to come to the United States. And so a P2 is similar to traditional refugee resettlement. You are processed in a third country. You would arrive here in the United States as a refugee. With parole, it's a bit more complicated. And this is squarely the work that Project Ally is engaged in, because humanitarian parole is an application that we file here in the United States. There's a United States sponsor. There is the Afghan national who's the beneficiary. And we're not talking about just one person. Often we're talking about units, families. So we're talking about 6 to 10 family members per case. And so these nationals are applying here. Once their parole gets approved, there's a second step that they have to follow, which requires them to go to an embassy to obtain a travel document. But as we know, there is no embassy in Afghanistan any longer. So now families are stuck with either trying to travel to a third country, which we know has proven to be dangerous in many cases, or we are hearing that there may or may not be a way for them to travel to the United States simply with either the receipt of the parole application having been submitted or approval of the application. We have yet to see how that's going to play out, but we know that this is the only, this is giving families a fighting chance, and that is where GAIN and Project Ally are playing a part.
Awesome. Thanks for trying to help break that down. I think most of us that occupy this space that are not lawyers, it's kind of hard to keep all of these different classes straight, but they do have very different impacts on people and their status here in the U.S. I mean, one thing we're aware of is that folks that will be arriving who are not SIVs or not through the typical refugee resettlement program, they're not going to be eligible to adjust status to become legal permanent residents or green card holders at 1 year. And in fact, their protections, if you will be a 2-year period at which, unless they can apply for SIV status or the family reunification pathways, will have to apply through the asylum seeking process, right? So again, GAIN, asylum is right there in your name. Y'all do a lot of work in that space. For those of our supporters who, asylum may not necessarily be on their radar because they're used to us talking about refugees. Can you just, briefly give us an idea of what the current status is in the asylum process? Like, how long does it take? Is there an application fee? What is the rate of success for applications for asylum seekers? I think that'd be really informational for some of our supporters to hear.
Absolutely. I might need another hour to answer all of those questions, but I'm going to do my best and start by saying, excuse me, that asylum is a very complex process. Your ability to obtain asylum relief to stay in the United States depends on how you enter the United States, whether you have access to an attorney to help you navigate the process, whether your case is in immigration court or not. And so I'm glad that you bring this up, because it's important to understand that even if someone arrives in the United States as a parolee, that's a short-term relief. Long-term, they're going to have to find a way to find stability and long-term immigration relief. And that's where asylum comes into play, because as a parolee, you can either have a family member petition for you to remain here, you may qualify for SIV, or asylum. And asylum is a very, there's a legal definition for it that's informed by our federal laws, case law, but it's essentially someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their home country due to a well-founded fear of persecution. And that's, yes, that can be broken down, but there are basis for asylum has to be that they are fearing this persecution on account of their race, their religion, their nationality, their political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. And so each case has to be thoroughly vetted, and each case has to be looked at closely to see if there is a particular claim. And so what we're talking about here is hundreds or thousands of parolees who are going to arrive in the United States who are going to need that individualized consultation to determine if asylum is a remedy. Now here in Georgia, what we know is that we are home to the most difficult immigration court in the nation, and asylum approval rates are astonishing. You might find that across the country, there's about a 30 to 40%, perhaps more, 40, 50% chance of succeeding in your asylum case. And here in Georgia, it hovers somewhere around 2 to 5. And so even if you have a lawyer, the hill is a difficult one to climb. And so I say that to say that the process doesn't end just because somebody arrives here at the US border. It's going to require ongoing support and collaboration.
I agree. Thank you, Alpa, for giving us those sobering statistics. We had a whole other conversation around how we need to show solidarity with our brothers and sisters who are seeking those protections through the asylum, even outside of this conversation about our Afghan evacuees. So thank you for the work y'all are doing at GAIN. Chris, I want to turn to you. I know, part of what you all do at Vets for American Ideals is really advocacy and talking to elected officials and community members about changes in the system and the process that need to happen. And I know this particular issue around, welcoming our allies with this particular classification of humanitarian parolees, something you all actually have been advocating for changes to. So can you share a little bit about what that advocacy work is done and what community members here can do to support those efforts?
Yeah, so Alpa did a great job explaining how complicated our immigration system is. I think when people get into this, they start realizing like the Gordian knot that that our system can be. And so when we saw this crisis unfolding, we immediately realized that you were going to have all of these people coming to the U.S. under various statuses, right? And under various levels of the status. So you come in an SIV, you might be SIV approved. There are people who are at the early stages of the SIV, at the late stages, they somehow got on a plane, which, we have a moral obligation to resettle those people. How do we do right by all of these folks who are coming in under these different statuses? And so what we did is we have gotten, I guess, 3 things that we're trying to get past. Well, really 4. I'll talk about the 4th one in a minute. The first one is to ensure that folks coming in, regardless of status, if they're on humanitarian parole, that they have access to the U.S. To the Refugee Assistance Program, that they can get the benefits that any other refugee can apply for. Because I think when we think about the Refugee Assistance Program and being like this, humanitarian parole is probably what you're offered is this. It is a tiny fraction of what is normally out there. So that is one thing that we want to make sure gets passed into law. The second thing is we want to make sure that the money is there. So we have authorization to spend that money and appropriation to make sure that money actually goes where it is. I'm getting to some technical, like fancy DC talk. So if I get too wonky, let me know. But basically all that means is we need money for these folks. They're coming in, so there needs to be literally billions of dollars to be funded in the refugee admissions program for those people who otherwise wouldn't have been able to access those benefits to now have that. And then the third thing is this is really critical. The people coming in different statuses, to Alpa's point, would go to the back of the line of the asylum system, which means that they could wait for years to get their asylum claim to be heard. And in many instances, when you go into asylum, you have to give, an interview to essentially prove that you are worthy of asylum in the United States. Well, in order to be found, have a credible fear of persecution, you often need documentation to prove that you would be persecuted or you would be tortured or whatever it was that you're claiming that is actually true. Well, during the fall of Kabul and as in Afghanistan collapsed, many Afghans at the behest of the U.S. State Department, regardless of what the secretary says, frankly, in front of Congress, were destroying their documents because they knew that if the Taliban conducted a house-to-house raid, which they have done and are continuing to do. And they were found with any documentation that would prove that they were part of, worked alongside a Western power, let alone the United States, that they face imminent physical danger up to and including death. So these folks, they called us, they emailed us, they sent us videos of them burning their documents. Files and folders that stretch back decades went up in flames in moments. And now these people are on flights to the United States, and they would have no way of proving that they had this credible fear of persecution and therefore would be eligible for asylum. So what we need is an adjustment act, an Afghan Adjustment Act, which we are hopeful that the US government or that the Congress will include in a must-pass spending bill or must-pass bill this year. That would automatically adjust individuals as they come in to a status that would give them legal permanent residency and then onwards pathways to citizenship. This would go a long way in rectifying the sin of our withdrawal. And I don't want to say that I think a lot of us here supported ending the forever war, but the manner in which we did it put a lot of these people in grave risk and prevented them from being able to claim the rights that they normally would have been able to do. People who would be eligible for the SIV program no longer had that documentation. People who would be eligible for P2 no longer had that documentation. And so what this is a congressional fix that would solve this problem. And it's the only way that we're going to prevent a massive backlog in the asylum system and frankly do what is morally and ethically right to these people. So 2 out of those, last thing I'll say on this, I know we're running out of time, but 2 out of those 3 things are in the continuing resolution that is on the floor right now that is being held up by debt limit negotiations in Congress. So you have the portion of the bill that would fund the refugee resettlement program, and then another portion which would give the rights of individuals to apply for those benefits. The one thing that we're missing is the Afghan Adjustment Act, and that needs to be passed by the end of the year, or we're going to be facing dire situation in 2022.
Yeah, Chris, thank you for that. I mean, to follow up on Alpa's sort of immigration primer of terms of what's happening with these different statuses with a very clear understanding of what the political or congressional fix to these issues are. I mean, the fixes are there. I think obviously you all at Veterans for American Ideals, I know through our work at the Coalition of Refugee Service Agencies, amongst others, we know there are fixes there. We just need to put pressure on our elected officials to see this through. And like you said, to understand this as a larger moral and ethical calling that we must live up to, right? That is imperative. I keep talking about this as a generational event, and when the history is written, how will we react and how have we responded? And so, we need everybody on that same page. So thank you for that. We have about 5-6 minutes left. We have some questions. We probably are going to go over a little bit, but just for those of you who I know may have scheduled your time today to be done at 2 o'clock to get on with other things, your workday and everything else, we want to thank you for being here. We probably will go over by about 10 or 15 minutes, but I do want to just sort of end with this last part. I want to be very clear, and I want to give each of our panelists the opportunity to just really make a call to action, right? To the over 100 people on this call right now, to the hundreds of people that will see this in recording later on as we share it with our networks. We've been talking about how we've got to come together as a community to serve. And so I just want to give each of our panelists just a few minutes to share your call to action to our viewers today. And so, Marjan, would you like to start us?
Sure. So I think my call to action really is going to be focused on the importance of, as Chris has emphasized, as Alpa mentioned, like there's going to be many different individuals here in terms of their statuses. But at the end of the day, the most important thing is making sure that we advocate for everyone equally, and everyone's doing that in their own different respective ways through platform. But advocacy is the most important thing to make sure that everyone has access to these benefits. And as we've emphasized here, we can get into the politics of when we should have withdrawn and should we end, like But at the end of the day, the manner in which the withdrawal happened has risked so many lives. Individuals are not able to go outside right now. They have to have a burner phone just so that they're not searched. There are lives that are in imminent danger, and we have a responsibility to make sure that the individuals that we do have we are able to serve. We serve them in a manner that is really holistic, and also that we advocate for their rights and their pathway to legal permanent residence and then citizenship here. And then in terms of, what I would like to personally emphasize is we also need to make sure that we keep in touch with the fact that we are global citizens, especially for what the Afghan women are dealing with. They have been, we have individuals that were teachers, students, like everyone has now been trapped inside of their homes. Like Afghan girls and Afghan women are fearful to go outside of their homes right now. So raising your voices and making sure that we keep that conversation alive and that we understand the impact of the uncertainty their futures have right now is very, very important. I can't emphasize this enough. And I know that it seems from here we're not able to do much, but just as much as you're able to educate the next person, as you're able to share a news cycle, as you keep the conversation alive, making sure that those stories and those individuals are not forgotten. And then obviously the individuals that we will get the opportunity to serving them in a holistic manner that is representative of their actual needs.
Thank you, Marjan. Alpa?
Well, I think we've touched on a number of legal barriers that are getting in the way of families being able to come together, travel to the United States and find safety. But there are some common sense solutions. We have filing fees for humanitarian parole applications that are $575 per person, whether you're a parent or a child. One of our client families, the mother just gave birth to her son this week, and we need to file a humanitarian parole application for him, and that is also $575. And so this is an incredible burden on the families who are here in the United States wanting to sponsor their loved ones. And so we are asking for support in the collection of those filing fees. We are asking for US nationals, residents who are interested in sponsoring an Afghan family. That is, again, a big bottleneck for us. We have, as Marjan mentioned, families, women, girls, people who have very credible stories and reason to believe that they're under threat of harm, and they need to be able to find safety here in the United States, but they are unable to apply for parole because they don't have a sponsor here in the US. We've seen over the last month, we've an influx of volunteers. As we've also talked about, language access is extremely important for us. So if you speak Farsi or Pashto, we need you. We need you to help us with intakes. We need you to help us translate documents. We are currently tapping into our own resources to be able to translate birth certificates, any documents that our families do have. As Chris mentioned, there's a lot of documents that they were unable to leave with, but we are trying our best to manage that effort as well. And I will just say, if you have signed up to volunteer, or if you're interested in volunteering, please stay with us, because as we've said, there's an immediate response, and then there's going to be long-term need and response. And we may not have an opportunity for you to tap in at the moment, but we hear you, we see you, we appreciate you. And as a community, we are collectively talking about ways to mobilize you.
Thank you, Alpa. Chris?
Sorry, everybody. I promise I have been paying attention. My wife is very pregnant and has been messaging me from the doctor's office. So that's what's been distracting me. I really the call to action here really is to support your local communities, right? After the past 5 years, we have really seen historic disinvestment from resettlement agencies, and they need your help. I mean, Human Rights First and Vets for American Ideals would gladly put you to work at the national level, but the real work that needs to be done here needs to be done at the IRC here in Atlanta to welcome these 1,000 or so individuals as they come in. So however it is that you donate, your time, your treasure, your talents, you need to give locally. This is how we're going to get through this. Justin mentioned a whole of government response. I mean, we're thinking bigger than this. This has got to be a whole of society response. So if you own a business and you need to hire somebody, hire a refugee. If you have extra resources that you can give to fill up a food pantry, do that. If you have housing that you can donate for homes for refugees, do that. I had a veteran call me a couple weeks ago and he said, man, Chris, I don't know how I'm going to give back, but I think I'm going to have to buy a house to house these refugees that are coming in. And I said, well, Steve, that's probably not the best use of your time. He's like, no, I'm going to do it. So if you have that resources, go ahead and do that. I know the housing market is rough. And if you want to advocate at the national level, look, we need those three things that I brought up. We need the Afghan Adjustment Act, we need the funding, and we need what's called the Welcome Act, which is the access to those resources. So the last two of those, as I mentioned, are included in the continuing resolution. So please call Senator Warnock and Senator Ossoff to help get that CR across the finish line in the Senate. So one, we don't avoid a government shutdown, and two, we get these resources out as quickly as possible. And then for the Afghan Adjustment Act, I'd really encourage you all to reach out to those offices again at the congressional and Senate, in the House and Senate side, and ask them to co-sponsor this. We have some champions on the Hill, but they're going to need help, and we're going to need to try to get this done by the end of the year. There are a couple must-pass bills that we think that are the best suited for this, but really, we need to get an Adjustment Act by December 31st, or we're going to see a huge influx of asylum cases in the backlog. So that's my call to action right now.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody. And, I'd be remiss if I didn't have my own call to action as part of the IRC here in Atlanta. And like I said, we've made the very bold and ambitious, and we believe our humanitarian and moral calling to step up and to agree to welcome and serve 800 Afghans that will be arriving in the next 6 months. That's in addition to 900 refugees through the refugee resettlement pipeline, and then just about 100 SIVs as well. So, we believe now is the time to be ambitious and bold. And so, today we're actually also announcing that we have an ambitious goal of raising $1.7 million to ensure that newly arrived families from all the various variety of immigration statuses actually have everything they need to integrate and thrive into our communities. And we need support from individuals, the corporate sector, the business owners, from faith communities, from just community sponsors like people on this call today. I just want to, encourage everybody to consider becoming a monthly donor at any amount. Even a one-time donation is helpful, but those monthly donors really help us plan out our year to make sure that we have the Atlanta-based staff here that we need to continue welcoming and serving refugees, SIVs, and parolees from Afghanistan, but also other crisis areas around the world. I just want everybody to be aware that, when you donate to the IRC in Atlanta, you are providing really emergency financial support for families to cover unmet housing costs and unmet medical costs. There's been comments already about what benefits and resources parolees will be eligible for compared to refugees. And so we know that there's going to be additional support. That will also be to support things like food distribution, school supplies, hygiene kits, all the things that we know new Americans arriving here into Georgia need just to get themselves started, right? And when you invest in our local staff capacity, which is really the heart of our service delivery model, that ensures that we have compassionate, empathetic professionals that are ready to welcome new families and help them secure employment, learn English, enroll in school, and really start their new lives here, right? And to be honest, too, this year, we're also talking about how we can use the blessings of the support of our community supporters in raising that ambitious goal to support our fellow practitioners and our fellow service providers. We know that GAIN needs support in helping to, if the asylum pathway is the pathway, we're committed to make sure GAIN has the resources they need and the community has the resources they need that we can see these asylum applications through. That's our responsibility. We would be remiss if we help bring people here to Atlanta and then not provide them with the support throughout this entire process. Same thing with our friends at Refugee Women's Network. Do amazing work, Herculean amount of work on such a committed staff. Imagine much more they could do with more staff and us working more closely together. And so, again, to Chris's point, yes, this is a whole of government response. This is a whole of society response. This is a whole of service sector response right now to this. And I believe we as Americans believe and will step up to the plate. And so this is sort of our clarion call as we begin. Our fiscal year actually starts on Friday, October the 1st. And so we've decided that this is what is needed right now to support newly arrived community members. And so with that, I also want to encourage people to reach out. I know Fiona, our communications and external relations director, and Kaylee, our senior development manager, have been sharing links in our chat to each of these different organizations. I want to encourage you all to get involved. It is to reach out to find other ways to get involved. If it's through volunteerism, if it's through housing, like Chris said, if you have a house, if you are a hotel or a motel owner and you want to donate 25% of your rooms to a resettlement agency for these next 3 months, because we get very short notice on people arrival, sometimes less than 24 hours, 48 hours, that is really helpful right now. So again, to the employer community, reach out about hiring, like Chris said, hiring refugees, hiring parolees. Realize that people that we are welcoming are here and they are eligible to work. People want to work. They understand that economic self-sufficiency through work is the best way to ensure the stability for their families right here, right now. Marjan is the economic empowerment manager. I mean, a lot of the programming they do there as well as here is to empower our families economically, help them navigate these systems. But all of these things require knowledge, they require commitment, and they require resources. So again, I want to encourage everybody to assist these different organizations as we collectively look to serve our newly arriving allies as they arrive from Afghanistan. So I want to, again, we're already about 8 minutes over the hour. I want to thank everybody again for being here today. As you can tell, this is such a both needed but also robust conversation. And like Alpa said, I mean, these are the people with the knowledge on the ground. These are folks who work in this space day in and day out. These are the experts who can address immigration needs or service needs, or how do we talk across the aisle, and how do we talk to our elected officials? How do we build bridges amongst ourselves rather than continue these divides? And I just want to thank, again, everybody, this great group of panelists for being here. I want to thank all of our attendees for being here. I know there were a lot of questions. I know Fiona has been responding to many of them. And we will look at, maybe as we put this up for the community, maybe to have a Q&A response to this, since we're not going to get to all the questions right now. But again, reach out to us. We're here to have conversations offline and continue this conversation. We'll be having webinars in the future. I think a recap, somebody mentioned a recap webinar, 2-3 months down the line as we're into this further, like what have we accomplished, what our needs are. I think it's a great idea. So I just want to again thank Marjan, Alpa, and Chris for all you do, for all the work you're doing, for the people's lives you're impacting. I want to thank all of our supporters today for being with us today, and just wish you all a great rest of your Wednesday and a great week ahead. Thank you, everybody.